Julian Reed lived in a world built of glass and steel, where the reflective panes mirrored his image countless times, and the skyscrapers rose like the fingers of a sleeping god. At 42, he was the master of a global financial empire named Reed Global Holdings. From his penthouse office looking down on the streets of Chicago, he could stir markets and change the fates of nations with just a few phone calls. He was a king, but his kingdom was a magnificent prison. Solitude was not an abstract concept for Julian. It was a physical entity, a bespoke suit of armor woven from mergers, stocks, and real estate. It was heavy cold and could not be removed. Every one of his interactions was filtered through a thick membrane of assistants, lawyers, and public relations specialists. Everyone he met had been vetted, their smiles polished, their intentions sanitized. They laughed at his jokes no matter how bad they were. They agreed with his opinions no matter how half-baked. He lived in a forest of mirrors, each one reflecting a carefully constructed image of the man they thought he wanted to be. But the real Julian, the version who grew up in a small Ohio town, with dreams of becoming an architect, had been lost somewhere on the path to the top. That emptiness was an unhealing wound, smoldering and aching. A week prior, Julian had tried to fill that void in a different way. He drove a mid-range black sedan with no driver, no bodyguards. It was a car that would go unnoticed on the road. He had lunch at a small old sandwich shop. He watched the construction workers eat, laugh, and talk. They didn't care what he was wearing or who he was. They were just people living their lives. Julian saw something he hadn't seen in years, real eyes. Not eyes of admiration or subservience, just normal eyes. That's when Julian realized he didn't want to be seen as a god, he wanted to be seen as a man. And to do that, he had to become an ordinary man. This disguise, a ritual he had created for himself every few months, was a pilgrimage back to reality. He would shed the skin of Julian Reed, the king of finance, and don the persona of Jim, a drifter afloat in the world. The preparation was meticulous, almost a spiritual rite. He went to a vintage clothing store on the South Side where the clerks had no idea who Julian Reed was. They just looked at him and saw a man who needed clothes. He carefully selected an old corduroy jacket with frayed elbow patches, a faded flannel shirt, and a pair of jeans softened by time. Scuffed work boots and a few days' growth of stubble completed the transformation. He even wore a pair of non-prescription glasses with thick, unattractive frames. Looking at himself in the cracked mirror of a gas station restroom, he didn't see a billionaire, but a man who might be struggling to make next month's rent. This anonymity was a release, a salve for the perpetual burn of public scrutiny. Julian felt an incredible sense of relief. At last, he could breathe. His destination was the Gilded Steer, the flagship restaurant of his hospitality division. It was the crown jewel of his culinary holdings, a place renowned for its dry-aged beef, thousands of bottles of wine, and a clientele list that read like a who's who of the elite. He had acquired the restaurant group 2 years ago, and while the profit margins were excellent, he had never set foot in this specific location. The reports compiled by his CEO, Simon Price, spoke of impeccable service, flawless quality, and record-breaking revenue. But reports were just numbers on a page. They couldn't measure the soul of a place. Julian wanted to see it for himself through the eyes of someone who didn't matter. He pushed open the heavy brass door, and the city's noise was instantly replaced by the hushed symphony of fine dining. The air was thick with the scent of grilled meat, old leather, and expensive perfume. A warm wave from a roaring fireplace washed over him. The hostess, a tall blonde girl with a bright but fragile smile, gave his attire a quick, dismissive glance. "May I help you?" she asked, her tone implying he had wandered in by mistake. "A table for one," Julian said, his voice a little hoarser and less commanding than usual. She hesitated, her eyes sweeping over the lavish, dimly lit dining room. Most tables were filled with couples in evening wear and groups of men in tailored suits. "Do you have a reservation?" "No." "Is that a problem?" Her smile became strained. "We are quite booked. Let me see what I can do." She tapped her tablet with a perfectly manicured finger, the exaggerated gestures designed to convey the immense inconvenience he was causing. After a moment, she looked up. "I can seat you at a small table near the kitchen entrance. That's all we have available." It was a classic brush-off, a table reserved for guests, not deemed worthy of the main area. "That'll do," Julian said, playing the part. He followed her past the tables where diners paused their conversations to watch him pass, their curiosity laced with contempt. He was an anomaly in this curated environment, a weed in a rose garden. He felt their judgment like a physical touch, and a familiar bitter resentment coiled in his gut. This was the world he had built, a world that judged a man's worth by the cut of his suit. He was led to a small, wobbly table tucked into a nook exactly as she had promised. The swinging door to the kitchen constantly created a jarring sound of muffled clatter and shouting. It was the worst seat in the house. This was perfect. From his vantage point, he could observe the restaurant's machinery. He watched the waiters move with a predatory grace, their smiles calibrated to the assumed wealth of the tables. He saw the manager, a slick, dark-haired man, in a slightly too tight suit, fawning over a table that looked like city council members. Julian recognized him from the company files, Conrad Thorne. Thorne exuded a false charm that never reached his eyes. He laughed heartily at a client's joke, clapping them on the back. But the moment he turned away, the smile vanished, replaced by the alertness of a hawk. He snapped a small but sharp command at a passing busboy, who flinched and hurried away. Julian settled in, becoming a part of the scenery. He was invisible, and from this position of invisibility, he could finally see. He saw the subtle dance of class and expectation. He saw the performative subservience, the transactional kindness. It was exactly what he had expected. It was a well-oiled, efficient, profitable, and utterly soulless machine. A deep sigh escaped him. Was this all his empire was, creating polished surfaces with nothing beneath? Julian had been nursing a glass of water for about 10 minutes when a waitress came to his table. She was different from the others. While the rest of the staff had a cold, professional exterior, she seemed softer, almost fragile. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with large, intelligent brown eyes and chestnut hair tied back in a simple ponytail. Her uniform was neat but showed signs of wear. The white apron was faded at the creases. What he noticed most, however, was a faint tremor in her hands as she placed a basket of bread on his table. There were dark circles under her eyes, a weariness that her polite smile couldn't fully conceal. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice small but clear. "My name is Clara, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you off with a drink?" He looked at her name tag. Clara Bennett. It suited her. It was a classic, gentle name. He deliberately ordered the cheapest beer on the menu. He watched for any hint of disappointment, any subtle shift in her expression to betray her judgment. He saw nothing. "Of course," she said, in the same steady, pleasant tone. "I'll be right back." As she walked away, he noticed her shoes. They were standard black anti-slip shoes, but the soles were worn almost smooth, the leather cracked and peeling near the toes. They were the shoes of someone who had spent countless hours on their feet, someone for whom a new pair was a luxury she couldn't afford. It was a small detail, but it told a bigger story than any of Simon Price's financial reports. For the first time that night, Julian Reed felt a genuine curiosity. Who was this girl, Clara, who looked at a man in worn-out clothes and didn't see someone lesser, but simply a person he didn't know yet? But his simple, cynical test was about to expose a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of his company. And this quiet waitress with tired eyes and worn-out shoes was the only one brave enough to light the fuse. Julian Reed continued to observe not just the servers, but the room itself. He noticed the stark contrast between what he saw in the reports and what he was experiencing. Simon's reports spoke of impeccable service, but Julian felt a cold, robotic one. The staff's smiles were a mask, a transactional tool. He could feel the tension in the air, a low-lying anxiety that everyone except the wealthy diners seemed to feel. Suddenly, a group of well-dressed people at a table in the center of the dining room began to laugh loudly. Their laughter was not only loud, but also carried a hint of mockery. Julian recognized one of them, Marcus Vance, a tech investor he had met at a charity gala. Vance looked directly at Julian, smiled scornfully, and then pulled out his phone. Julian knew what was about to happen. Vance would film him a beggar in a fancy restaurant. Julian was used to being photographed, but those photos were usually a symbol of admiration, not ridicule. He felt a bitter taste rise in his throat. This was the world he had created, a world that judged a person based on their appearance, a world in which he had become a victim. Vance turned back to his friends, showing them the video. They laughed again. A woman in the group even pointed in Julian's direction, drawing more attention. Julian felt like an animal in a zoo exposed for public viewing. He tried to stay calm, looking them straight in the eyes. He couldn't believe that people he once respected could behave this way. This shattered what little faith he had left in the upper-class society he had built. When Clara returned with the beer, she saw Julian's eyes on Vance's table. She too sensed the tension. She knew Vance was a regular, notorious for his arrogance and disrespect. She had endured his unpleasantness before. But instead of ignoring it, she approached Julian and said softly, "Here's your beer, sir. You don't seem very comfortable." Julian looked up at her, his eyes no longer cynical but grateful. "Thank you," he said. "Looks like I picked the wrong place to relax." Clara smiled faintly. "It's a difficult place to relax, but everyone deserves a good meal, no matter who they are." Her words were not just a comfort, but a subtle defiance of the restaurant's rules. Julian felt a connection. This girl understood him. She understood the discrimination he was experiencing, and she chose to side with him, a complete stranger. As Clara walked away, Julian returned to his observation. He saw Conrad Thorne, the manager, approach Vance's table. Conrad clapped Vance on the shoulder, laughed loudly, and looked toward Julian with a smirk. They seemed to be talking about him. Julian could feel the animosity from Conrad, an animosity that went beyond class differences. Julian had seen enough. He no longer wanted to continue his simple test. He had found what he was looking for. But he felt something else. He felt a strong urge to protect Clara. This girl had put herself in a difficult position because of her kindness, and Julian, with all the power he had, could not let her suffer. This was no longer a game. It had become a mission. Julian Reed's life had always been strictly controlled, from his daily schedule to his personal relationships. But tonight, everything had changed. A waitress had broken all the rules and shown him something genuine. And he, a man who had lost faith in the world, had found a glimmer of hope. Julian decided he would not just leave after his meal. He would do something. He would return here, but not in the guise of Jim. He would return as Julian Reed, the owner of this restaurant. And he would do something for Clara. He would ensure that her kindness would not be punished. Julian ordered the most expensive wine on the menu, a vintage he was sure would get Conrad Thorne's attention. He would not allow himself to be looked down on. He would leave a mark, a sign that he was not a nobody. And he would make Conrad Thorne and people like Vance regret their contempt. As Julian took a sip of the wine, he thought about Clara. This girl had no idea that she had just changed the life of one of the world's richest men. She had simply done the right thing. And that was something Julian hadn't seen in so many years. Uncalculated kindness. It was something he had lost faith in. Suddenly he felt something. A strange sensation, a powerful urge. He not only wanted to protect Clara, he also wanted to discover her story. He wanted to know why a young woman like her had eyes full of weariness and worn-out shoes. He felt there was a bigger story at play. And he, a man who was always looking for a good story, wanted to be a part of it. Julian called Clara over and asked for the check. He left a large amount of cash on the table, enough to cover the meal and a generous tip. He looked at her, and for a moment, they shared a silent connection. He was not a king, and she was not a waitress. They were just two people facing their worlds. Julian left the restaurant, leaving behind an air of tension and chaos. He knew Conrad Thorne would not let it go. He would investigate him. And that was what Julian wanted. He would find Jim, but he would never find Julian Reed. Julian had placed his bet, and he was ready for this game. As Julian got into his car, he felt a sense of relief. He had found what he was looking for: honesty, kindness, and a story worth pursuing. He would not let this girl down. The heavy brass doors of the Gilded Steer closed behind Julian Reed like a sophisticated trap. The chaotic noise of Chicago, the blaring car horns, and the laughter of the crowd was abruptly left behind. Inside, the space seemed completely isolated, a different world created only by the soft tones of jazz music, the delicate clinking of glasses, and the low hum of important conversations. The air was thick with the scent of oak leather and the complex aroma of dry-aged beef. Julian stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. Everything in the restaurant was perfectly arranged, from the classic oil paintings on the walls and the sparkling crystal chandelier, like a constellation, to the meticulously polished mahogany floor that reflected the warm glow of the fireplace. This was his kingdom. But in this kingdom, Julian was an outsider. The hostess, a tall blonde girl, with a smile that seemed forged from ice, gave Julian a quick look from head to toe. Her gaze wasn't one of curiosity, but a cold, almost judgmental appraisal. She scanned his frayed corduroy jacket, the old jeans, and his scuffed work boots. In her eyes, Julian wasn't a customer, but a mistake, someone who had wandered into a place where he didn't belong. "May I help you?" Her voice rang out like a bell signaling the end. Julian was prepared for this. He had spent months practicing a more natural way of speaking, less commanding and authoritarian. "A table for one," he said, his voice deep and a little hoarse. The hostess hesitated. Her eyes swept over the dining room where couples in evening wear and men in tailored suits were enjoying their dinner. He saw a flicker of annoyance on her face, as if his presence were an unremovable stain. "Do you have a reservation?" She asked her question, not a confirmation, but a declaration. "No," Julian replied curtly. The smile on her face became stiff. "We are fully booked," she said, tapping her tablet dramatically. "Let me see if I can find a spot." She feigned busyness for a few seconds, as if to punish Julian for the inconvenience he was causing. After a moment, she looked up. "I can seat you at a small table near the kitchen entrance. That's all we have available." Julian knew this would happen. He wasn't surprised, but a wave of indignation still surged within him. This was a scene he had watched many times in movies, but experiencing it firsthand was completely different. "That'll do," he said. "Thank you." He followed her, feeling every eye on him. He was like a strange fish that had found its way into a meticulously decorated aquarium. Conversations suddenly fell silent. Curious and contemptuous eyes followed his every step. Julian felt that judgment like a second skin, hot and uncomfortable. He recalled a memory from his childhood, a time he wandered into a lavish party without an invitation, and he felt the same gazes, a mix of curiosity and disdain. That feeling after so many years was still just as potent. He felt a powerful sense of outrage. This was the world he had built. A world where a person's worth was measured by the amount of money in their bank account and the quality of the suit they wore. Julian felt he had become a sinner in his own kingdom. They arrived at a small corner hidden from the main view of the restaurant. The small, wobbly table was placed near the kitchen entrance. Julian could hear every sound echoing from inside: the clinking of knives, the banging of pots, the muffled shouts of the chefs. It was loud and chaotic, a complete contrast to the elegance outside. This was the outcast zone. But for Julian, this was a perfect spot. He could observe everything without being noticed. He was a ghost in his own kingdom. From his seat, Julian began to watch. He saw the servers move like sharks, preying on the tables that seemed wealthier. Their smiles, every gesture, were calculated to maximize their tips. He saw the manager, Conrad Thorne, with a forced smile and cold eyes fawning over wealthy customers. Julian recognized the artificiality in his every action. He laughed loudly with a guest, but the moment he turned his back, the smile vanished, replaced by a sharp and watchful gaze. He quietly, but sharply, snapped a command at a busboy, who flinched and hurried away. This observation brought Julian a profound sense of disappointment. He had built an empire, but it seemed to be just a money-making machine devoid of a soul. Everything was transactional, from the employees' smiles to the manager's kindness. A moment later, Julian noticed something unusual. He saw a group of people at a central table chuckling and pointing at him. He recognized one of them, Marcus Vance, a tech investor he had met at a charity gala. Julian remembered Vance as an arrogant person who loved to show off. Vance pulled out his phone, filmed a video of Julian, and burst into laughter with his friends. This incident ignited a cold fury in Julian. He was used to being photographed, but those photos were usually a symbol of admiration. This time, Julian was just a joke, a drifter who had wandered into a place where he didn't belong. He felt a deep sense of humiliation. He, the owner of this restaurant, was being scorned by the very people he had indirectly created. Julian looked straight into Vance's eyes, a gaze that didn't flinch. He would not let this humiliation make him lose his self-respect. He would not hide. He would face it. Julian ordered a beer, then ordered the most expensive steak on the menu, the Emperor's Cut, and a bottle of fine wine. He had decided he would not let anyone look down on him. He would show them that he wasn't a drifter. Julian took a sip of the wine, feeling the bitterness in his throat. His outrage had turned into a cold determination. He would not leave here with just a meal. He would leave a mark. And he would make people like Conrad Thorne and Marcus Vance pay. Julian Reed's life had once been a series of perfectly arranged events. But tonight, everything had changed. He had discovered something disturbing in his kingdom, and a painful truth about human nature. Julian Reed wasn't just a billionaire. He was a predator, and he had found his prey. He would not let any of them escape punishment. He would clean up his kingdom, starting with the gilded steer. Julian stared at Marcus Vance and Conrad Thorne, who were laughing at him. He knew they had no idea who the real Julian Reed was. They didn't know they had just woken a sleeping beast. Julian felt a cold exhilaration. This was a new game, and he would be the winner. As Julian sipped his wine, he thought about Clara. This girl had treated him with kindness when everyone else had scorned him. He felt a sudden warmth. He would not let her suffer for her kindness. He would protect her. Julian Reed had found a new purpose, and he would do everything to achieve it. The gloom in Julian Reed's heart subsided when he saw her. Clara Bennett, with all the weariness she carried on her shoulders, was the only bright spot in this dark room. As she approached Julian's table, he could see more clearly the details that were initially just a blur. Her eyes, a warm and intelligent brown, held a deep sadness emphasized by the dark circles underneath. Her chestnut hair was neatly tied back, but a few loose strands clung to her temples, as if they too were tired. Her uniform, though clean, had a faded white apron and frayed shirt cuffs. This wasn't a sign of carelessness, but evidence of long, continuous shifts. But the most telling detail was her shoes. The soles were worn almost smooth with small cracks running along the leather. Julian had seen such shoes on the streets worn by people who walked for miles every day. For Clara, those shoes were not just protection, but a mirror reflecting her life. Most notably, there was a faint bruise on her right forearm, a bruise she was trying to hide clumsily under her sleeve. It was a small detail, but for an observant person like Julian, it was like an alarm bell ringing in a quiet room. He could sense that it wasn't the result of a random accident in the kitchen, but the result of intentional abuse. "Good evening, sir." Clara's voice was soft but clear. "My name is Clara, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Have you decided on a drink?" Julian looked straight into her eyes. There was no judgment, no contempt, just weariness and a genuine kindness. He felt a strong urge to tell her that he wasn't a vagrant, but he held back. "A beer," Julian said deliberately, choosing the cheapest one on the menu. Clara showed no surprise or disappointment. She smiled politely, a smile not as fake as the others. "Of course I'll be right back with that." As she turned away, Julian saw Conrad Thorne, the manager, standing at the bar. Thorne was watching Clara with a cold glare. He saw that Julian had ordered a cheap beer and curled his lip in a contemptuous sneer. Julian could sense that Thorne was looking down on Clara for wasting her time on a guest who couldn't afford a proper meal. Clara returned with the beer, placing it carefully on the table. Julian decided to continue the charade. "Could I see a menu?" he asked. Clara took a menu from the stand and handed it to him. Julian opened it and immediately scanned for the most expensive item. "The Emperor's Cut," he said definitively. "I'll have that." For a brief moment, Clara's professional demeanor almost collapsed. Her eyes widened in surprise. The empire Julian had built was so well known that even a tired waitress like Clara knew the Emperor's Cut was a symbol of luxury, a 48-ounce, 90-day dry-aged porterhouse served with truffle sauce and seared foie gras, priced at $500. This dish wasn't for dining. It was a performance for Instagram or a corporate expense account. It wasn't for a man in a flannel shirt. Clara glanced at his worn-out shoes, then back at his calm face. Was this a joke? Was he a vlogger trying to get views? Or just a drunk man? Fear crept into her mind. What would Conrad Thorne do if this customer couldn't pay? He would deduct the full amount directly from her salary and tips. But when she looked into Julian's eyes, she didn't see arrogance or delusion. She only saw a quiet composure and a subtle challenge. He was testing her. And in that moment, Clara made a decision. She would treat him with respect, just as she would any other customer. A small, genuine smile appeared on her lips. "An excellent choice, sir," she said, her voice steady. "How would you like that prepared?" "Medium rare," Julian replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "And a glass of Chateau Blanc, 1998. This time, Clara was truly stunned. A bottle of that Chateau Blanc was worth over $2,000. A glass was a $300 proposition. In total, this guest's meal was more expensive than her monthly rent. According to Conrad Thorne's rules, she should have asked for his credit card up front. But her instincts and a strange sense of empathy for this man told her to trust him. "Right away, sir," she said, her voice not trembling at all. She turned away, her heart pounding. She could feel Conrad Thorne staring at her. She entered the order into the computer, her fingers shaking. The system automatically reported high-value orders to the manager's computer. Clara knew Conrad would come over immediately. Sure enough, Conrad stopped her near the wine bar. "Clara," he said, in a low, threatening tone. "What the hell are you doing? Table 32 just ordered the Emperor's Cut and a glass of 98 Chateau Blanc." "Yes, Mr. Thorne. I just entered the order." "Are you insane? Do you see what that guy looks like? He looks like he just crawled out of a refugee camp. Didn't you ask for his credit card first?" "He didn't seem to be joking, sir," Clara said, keeping her voice low and respectful. "I didn't want to offend the customer." "Offend the customer?" Thorne sneered, his voice filled with venom. "He is offending us by being here. When he runs off, that $500 steak and $300 glass of wine will be deducted straight from your pay. Do you understand?" He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of coffee. "You're on thin ice. Don't make me push you off." Fear surged through Clara. He was right. If Julian didn't pay, she would be ruined. The debt Conrad had saddled her with would become astronomical. She would lose her job, and Leo would lose his only source of support. But when she looked over Conrad's shoulder toward table 32, she saw Julian watching them. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see the tension between them. He saw Conrad's aggression and her fear, and he nodded a slow, almost imperceptible gesture. It was a small motion, but it sent a jolt of courage through her. He knew. He saw her. In that moment, she felt less alone. "I understand, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll take full responsibility." Conrad stared at her for another moment, then walked away, muttering under his breath. Clara took a deep, shaky breath and went to retrieve the legendary wine bottle. She handled the bottle like a sacred object, using the special corkscrew to pour it perfectly. When she brought the wine to the table, her hand was no longer trembling. "Your Chateau Blanc, sir," she said. Julian took the glass, swirling the ruby-colored liquid. He didn't taste it immediately. Instead, he looked at her. "Is everything all right, Clara?" he asked. "Your manager seems agitated." "Everything is fine, sir." She lied the professional mask back in place. "He's just very passionate about maintaining our standards." Julian took a sip of the wine, closing his eyes for a moment to savor it. When they opened, they looked straight into hers. "I have a feeling," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial, "that your standards are higher than his." Clara's breath caught in her throat. He had seen right through her. He had seen the lies, the fear, the struggle. He had seen her. That unspoken understanding created a fragile but powerful connection between them. Julian ate his steak slowly, savoring every perfectly cooked bite while he continued to observe Clara. He watched the way she moved, the way she interacted with other customers, especially the ones who didn't seem wealthy. She always treated everyone with respect, something Julian rarely saw in his world. He also noticed how Conrad Thorne treated Clara. He was always lurking around her, watching her every move, and occasionally whispering something threatening. Julian could feel the tension in the air every time Thorne passed by Clara. He felt a strong urge to stand up and confront him, but he knew that would ruin his charade. When Julian finished his meal, Clara came to clear the table. She worked professionally, but there was a deep weariness in her every motion. Julian looked at her, and he saw that she was not just tired from work. She was tired from the burden she was carrying on her shoulders. "Where do you live?" Julian asked a surprising question. Clara was a little startled. "On the south side," she replied, her voice cautious. "That's far." "Yes, but it's close enough for me to visit my brother," she said. Julian paused. "Is your brother sick?" Clara looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. She didn't understand why a stranger was asking about her personal life. "Yes," she said quietly. "He has a lung condition. He's been in the hospital for almost a month." "I'm so sorry to hear that," Julian said. "I hope he gets better." Clara nodded, a tear rolling down her cheek. "Thank you. You're the only person who has asked about him." That moment changed everything. Julian was no longer a customer, and Clara was no longer a waitress. They were just two people sharing a moment of pain and empathy. After Clara cleared the table, Julian ordered an espresso. He wanted more time to observe her. He wanted to understand her story better. He could feel that her story wasn't just about poverty and illness, but also about courage and sacrifice. Julian thought about Simon's reports. The numbers could never tell the story of a young woman working 2 shifts a day to pay for her brother's medical treatment. They could never tell the story of a greedy manager abusing his power. Julian felt a strong urge to help Clara. He wanted to get her out of here. He wanted to show her that the world wasn't a bad place. He wanted to show her that there were good people, people who were willing to help. Julian called Clara over and asked for the check. He placed a large amount of cash on the table, enough to pay for the meal and a generous tip. He looked at her, and for a moment, they shared a silent connection. He was not a king, and she was not a waitress. They were just two people facing their worlds. As Julian prepared to leave, he saw Conrad Thorne approaching. Conrad saw the money Julian had paid, and the vicious smile on his face became even more pronounced. He thought he had outsmarted both Julian and Clara. But Julian was ready. He looked straight into Conrad's eyes and said, "Mr. Thorne, the meal was delicious, but I have a question for you. Do you know that your meat is contaminated?" Conrad flinched. The smile on his face vanished. He looked at Julian with a panicked stare. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice filled with fear. "I know," Julian said. "And I know that Ms. Bennett tried to warn me. I know that she is being threatened by you. I know everything." Julian turned and walked away, leaving behind a trembling Conrad Thorne. Julian knew he wouldn't let it go. He would investigate him. And that was what Julian wanted. He would find Jim, but he would never find Julian Reed. Julian had placed his bet, and he was ready for this game. After Julian left, Clara continued her work mechanically. She cleared tables and served other guests, but her mind had drifted far away. Her eyes, already tired, were now filled with a new anxiety, a fear she couldn't name. Who was that man? How did he know about her brother? And most importantly, why did he say that Conrad Thorne was poisoning the supply chain? Hara Bennett, 23, lived a life defined by sacrifice. Her life had no room for college dreams dates or nights out with friends. Everything ended 2 years ago when her younger brother Leo was diagnosed with a rare lung disease. Since then, her life had revolved around a single goal: earning enough money to keep her brother alive. Leo, 17. A smart and resilient boy, once dreamed of becoming a musician. But now his life was a relentless loop of doctor's appointments, medication, infusions, and haunting emergency trips. Her mother had passed away 3 years prior, leaving her with the sole burden of caring for Leo. Their health insurance had run out long ago, and every dollar she earned, every tip she received was poured into the bottomless pit of medical bills. Her job at the Gilded Steer was her only salvation. The salary here was higher than any other service job she could find, and the tips were generous. But it came with a price she hadn't anticipated. The manager, Conrad Thorne, was a predator in a well-tailored suit. He had discovered a small error in Clara's bookkeeping, a mistake she had made during an overworked night shift. It was a minor, easily fixable error, but in Conrad's hands it became a deadly weapon. He had cornered her in his office, his voice full of threats. He accused her of stealing, threatening to fire her, and blacklist her, ensuring she would never find a decent job in the city again. And then he offered a deal. Clara could work to pay off a debt he had inflated to $5,000. Her salary would be withheld, and her tips would be monitored. In reality, she had become his slave. Clara knew he was lying. She knew the debt was fake, but she had no proof, and the threat of losing this job paralyzed her. She couldn't take that risk. Losing her job meant losing her livelihood, which meant Leo would have no medication. But what was worse was that Conrad had started forcing her to help him falsify ledgers at night. Clara had studied accounting at a community college for 2 years before Leo's condition worsened, and she had to drop out. Conrad had exploited that knowledge. He made her reconcile fake invoices to help him hide much bigger crimes. Clara had seen the mismatched numbers invoices from suppliers she had never heard of, large sums of money transferred into an account belonging to a shell company. She was trapped, an unwilling accomplice to a crime she was only just beginning to understand. Every shift was a tightrope walk over a chasm of fear. When she first saw the man in the corduroy jacket sitting at table 32, her empathy was immediate. It was the worst table where Conrad relegated people he considered undeserving. She had seen the hostess lead him there with a contemptuous smile. The other servers probably would have ignored him, focusing their energy on tables more likely to yield a big tip. But Clara didn't. Her mother had always taught her that a person's worth was not in their wallet, but in their character. She approached him with the same genuine respect she had given the CEO at table 5. When he ordered the cheapest beer, she simply nodded and smiled. It was a small act of rebellion against the restaurant's unspoken hierarchy. As she worked, she kept an eye on him. He wasn't on his phone, nor did he try to get anyone's attention. He just observed, his eyes scanning the room with a quiet, unnerving intelligence. There was a stillness about him, a calmness that seemed to contradict his shabby appearance. He didn't look like a man down on his luck, but rather a predator in disguise, patiently observing his territory. When she returned to take his order, she was prepared. "Have you decided on your main course, sir?" Julian looked up from the leather menu, his eyes meeting hers over his thick-rimmed glasses. "Yes, I think I'll have the Emperor's cut." Clara's professionalism almost broke. The Emperor's cut, a 48-ounce, 90-day dry-aged porterhouse steak, served with truffle sauce and seared foie gras, valued at $500. It was a meal ordered as a performance for Instagram to be paid with a corporate credit card. It was not something a man in a worn-out flannel shirt would order. She looked down at his worn-out shoes, then back up at his calm, unreadable face. Her mind raced. Was this a joke? Was he a food blogger trying to create a viral video, or was he simply delusional? Conrad Thorne would be furious if this man couldn't pay. She had a choice. She could question him, embarrass him, and guide him towards a more appropriate dish. That's what Conrad would do. But then she looked into his eyes again. There was no boastfulness, not a hint of delusion, only a quiet challenge. It was like a test. And in that moment, Clara made a decision. She would treat him with respect. She would give him the same assumption of legitimacy that she had given everyone else. A small, genuine smile appeared on her lips. "An excellent choice, sir," she said, her voice steady. "How would you like that prepared, medium rare?" he replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "And a glass of Chateau Blanc, 1998. Now she was truly stunned. That Chateau Blanc was worth over $2,000 a bottle. A glass was a $300 proposition. In total, this guest's meal was more expensive than her monthly rent. According to Conrad Thorne's rules, she was supposed to get a credit card from the guest beforehand. But her instinct and a strange sense of empathy for this man told her to trust him. "Right away, sir," she said, her voice not trembling at all. She turned away, her heart pounding. She could feel Conrad's eyes on her from across the room. She entered the order into the computer, her fingers shaking. The system automatically reported high-value orders to the manager's computer. Clara knew Conrad would come over immediately. Sure enough, Conrad intercepted her near the wine bar. "Clara," he said in a low, threatening tone. "What the hell are you doing? Table 32 just ordered the Emperor's Cut and a glass of 98 Chateau Blanc." "Yes, Mr. Thorne. I just entered the order." "Are you insane? Do you see what that guy looks like? He looks like he just crawled out of a refugee camp. Didn't you ask for his credit card first?" "He didn't seem to be joking, sir," Clara said, keeping her voice low and respectful. "I didn't want to offend the customer." "Offend the customer?" Thorne sneered, his voice filled with venom. "He is offending us by being here. When he runs off, that $500 steak and $300 glass of wine will be deducted straight from your pay. Do you understand?" He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of coffee. "You're on thin ice, don't make me push you off." Fear surged through Clara. He was right. If Julian didn't pay, she would be ruined. The debt Conrad had saddled her with would become astronomical. She would lose her job, and Leo would lose his only source of support. But when she looked over Conrad's shoulder toward table 32, she saw Julian watching them. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see the tension between them. He saw Conrad's aggression and her fear, and he nodded a slow, almost imperceptible gesture. It was a small motion, but it sent a jolt of courage through her. He knew. He saw her. In that moment, she felt less alone. "I understand, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll take full responsibility." Conrad stared at her for another moment, then walked away, muttering under his breath. Clara took a deep, shaky breath and went to retrieve the legendary wine bottle. She handled the bottle like a sacred object, using the special corkscrew to pour it perfectly. When she brought the wine to the table, her hand was no longer trembling. "Your Chateau Blanc, sir," she said. Julian took the glass, swirling the ruby-colored liquid. He didn't taste it immediately. Instead, he looked at her. "Is everything all right, Clara?" he asked. "Your manager seems agitated." "Everything is fine, sir." She lied the professional mask back in place. "He's just very passionate about maintaining our standards." Julian took a sip of the wine, closing his eyes for a moment to savor it. When they opened, they looked straight into hers. "I have a feeling," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial, "that your standards are higher than his." Clara's breath caught in her throat. He had seen right through her. He had seen the lies, the fear, the struggle. He had seen her. The brief dialogue with Julian Bennett had changed everything in Clara's mind. As she continued to work, a bold and crazy idea began to form in her head. This man was different. He had a power not in Conrad's way, but in a deeper, more fundamental way. He was a man who understood value beyond price. Maybe, just maybe, he was the savior she and Leo desperately needed. It was a crazy gamble, one that could destroy her life. But as she watched Conrad from afar, laughing loudly with wealthy clients, while slowly draining the life from his employees, she knew she had no other choice. She had to take the risk. She had to try and send him a message. The rhythm of the dinner service continued, a relentless flow of orders, plates, and polite inquiries. Clara moved in a state of automaticity, her body performing the familiar dance while her mind raced plotting. The man at table 32, her mysterious, paradoxical guest, had finished his coffee. Time was running out. Each time she passed his table, she could feel his observing gaze. It wasn't a predatory or uncomfortable look. It was the look of a man who was waiting for something. Her plan was both simple and highly risky. She couldn't talk to him openly, as Conrad's eyes were always sweeping the room. A whisper could be overheard. A direct conversation would be career suicide. A note was her only option. A silent plea, a shot in the absolute dark. What would she write? "Help me." It sounded pathetic, desperate. "My boss is a crook." It sounded like the complaint of a disgruntled employee. No, it had to be something more. Something that would pique the curiosity of a man like him. Something that hinted at a problem much larger than her own. She thought about the coded ledger that Conrad forced her to reconcile the invoices from Prime Organic Meats, a company that didn't seem to exist in any legitimate business database, the large sums of money transferred into a shell company's account. She didn't know the whole story, but she knew enough to know that it was dirty. It was a secret that Conrad would do anything to protect. That secret would be her weapon. During a brief lull, she slipped into the employee break room, a cramped, windowless space that smelled of old coffee and desperation. Her heart pounded in her chest. She grabbed a new crisp linen napkin identical to the ones on the tables. Her hands trembled so much that she could barely hold the pen she pulled from her apron pocket. She took a deep breath, trying to channel the courage she had seen in the stranger's eyes. She had to be concise, intriguing, and alarming. She had to give him a reason to believe her, a breadcrumb to follow. "They're watching you." That was a dramatic opening. It would make him question everything, make him paranoid. Who were they? Why were they watching him? The kitchen isn't safe. Vague but menacing. It could mean anything from poor sanitation to something far worse. It cast doubt on the very product he had just consumed. "Check the ledger in Thorne's office. He's poisoning the supply chain." This was the core of the issue. The ledger was the evidence. Poisoning the supply chain was a phrase that spoke of corruption, of a systemic problem. It sounded professional, serious. It wasn't a personal plea. It was a warning about the integrity of the entire establishment. It was a problem a man of his stature would want to investigate. She didn't sign it. The note had to be anonymous, a whisper from a ghost. She carefully folded the napkin into a small, tight square and hid it deep in her apron pocket. The feel of it against her leg was like holding a live coal. Her shift was nearing its end. Julian had paid, leaving an exact amount of cash on the small black tray. That was another strange detail. No credit card meant no name, but the amount was precise, not rounded. It was the act of a man who worked with numbers. He was waiting. When she returned to his table for the final clear, her heartbeat hammered in her ears. Conrad Thorne was standing near the reception desk, talking to a guest, his back to her. This was her chance. "Is there anything else you need, sir?" she asked, her voice miraculously steady. "No, thank you, Clara. The meal was excellent," he said. His eyes, however, said something else entirely. They were focused, expectant. "I'm glad to hear that." With practiced motions, she began to clear the coffee and water glasses. Her hands moved over the table with professional briskness. As her right hand lifted the empty sugar caddy, her left hand, out of everyone's sight, slid the folded napkin from her pocket and placed it on the table, instantly covering it with the bill tray she was also clearing. The entire process took less than a second. It was a magic trick born of desperation. She lifted the tray, the note now hidden underneath, and turned to walk away. But Julian spoke again, his voice so sharp it could cut through the dining room's noise. "Wait." Clara froze her back to him. Her blood ran cold. He had seen. Was he going to expose her right here? Was this a cruel game? A wave of panic rose within her. Slowly, she turned to face him. He was no longer looking at her, but at the empty space on the table where the bill tray had been. He had seen her place the note down, and he had seen her lift it up, hiding it under the tray. He had thought she was going to leave it. Her trick had been too clever. She had hidden it so well that he thought she had taken it back. His eyes rose to meet hers. There was no anger in them, only confusion and a hint of disappointment. Clara's mind reeled. She had failed. In her attempt at stealth, she had outsmarted herself. She stood there trapped by his gaze, the damned napkin burning a hole in the tray she was holding. She had to fix it. With a surge of courage she didn't know she possessed, she returned to the table. Her movements were stiff, unnatural. She could feel Conrad Thorne's attention shifting. His conversation paused. He was starting to watch her. She reached the table and, without a word, tilted the tray just enough for the small white square of the napkin to slide off and fall silently onto the polished wood. She didn't dare look at Julian. She couldn't. She simply placed the tray back on top of the note, leaving it for him this time. "You forgot your tip." She whispered the words, almost inaudible. It was a terrible, flimsy excuse, but it was the only thing she could think of. She turned and walked away, not daring to look back, her entire body trembling. She felt as though she had just jumped out of a plane without a parachute. Julian Blackwood had witnessed the entire scene from his table. He had seen Clara's confusion, the way she secretly put the napkin down, and then in a panic picked it up again. He had seen the failure on her face when she realized he hadn't taken it. And then he had seen the extraordinary courage when she returned, placed the napkin down again, and whispered a clumsy excuse. He couldn't help but be amazed. This was no ordinary waitress. She was a woman who was desperate but by no means weak. She had risked everything on a man she had just met based on a vague conviction. And she had done it with a bravery Julian rarely saw in his world of powerful men. Julian waited until Clara disappeared behind the kitchen doors. He glanced toward Conrad Thorne, the manager who was staring at his table with obvious suspicion. The charade was over. Julian calmly placed his hand on the bill tray, his fingers touching the napkin hidden underneath. He could feel the coarse linen, not the texture of paper money. He knew that the napkin was the tip. He stood up and put on his worn-out jacket. He gave a meaningless nod to Conrad Thorne, the way an ordinary person would to an authority figure he didn't want to get involved with. Then he turned and walked out of the restaurant. As Julian stepped outside, the cold air of the late Chicago night enveloped him. He leaned against the brick wall of the adjacent building, the city lights a dim glow around him. The sound of car horns and traffic seemed very distant. His heart was pounding faster than ever. He was no longer Julian Reed, the billionaire, but just a man on a dark street holding a secret. He unfolded the napkin. The hastily scrawled words seemed to glow under the streetlights. They are watching you. The kitchen is not safe. Check the ledger in Thorne's office. He is poisoning the supply chain. Julian read it once, then again. This was not a plea for a tip. It wasn't a waitress's phone number. It was a declaration of war. Poisoning the supply chain. The phrase was like a punch to the gut. It was an attack on the Blackwood brand, on the very promise of quality and luxury he had sold to the world. If it was true, it would be a cancer in his empire. If it was a lie, it would be a dangerous game. His simple test of honesty had uncovered something much darker. The quiet waitress with her worn-out shoes and fearful eyes hadn't just served him a meal. She had handed him a conspiracy on a napkin, a mystery that froze him and completely changed the course of that night, and perhaps his company as a whole. He turned back to look at the warm, golden light spilling from the windows of the Gilded Steer. It no longer looked like a restaurant. It looked like a crime scene. The city air, thick with the smell of rain and exhaust, did not clear Julian's head. The cryptic message on the napkin seemed to have branded itself onto his palm. His secret escapade, which began as a melancholic journey of self-discovery, had instantly transformed into a high-stakes corporate espionage thriller. The shift was abrupt, but it awakened a long, dormant part of him, the ruthless, decisive strategist who had built his empire from nothing. He walked for several blocks, letting the anonymity of the crowded sidewalk swallow him up. He needed to think, to separate the paranoid from the possible. They are watching you. Who Thorne or someone else was the warning for Jim, the drifter in the corduroy jacket, who had attracted unwanted attention? Or was it for Julian Reed, the owner they couldn't possibly know was there? The kitchen isn't safe. A sanitary violation, or something more sinister, poisoning the supply chain. That phrase resonated with a cold, sharp horror. It implied a deliberate systemic deception that went far beyond one greedy manager. It suggested an attack on the integrity of his entire brand. He found a quiet, dimly lit bar a few blocks away, a stark contrast to the opulence of the Gilded Steer. He chose a seat in the back, the worn leather cool against his skin, and ordered a neat whiskey. He pulled out his burner phone, a simple, untraceable device he kept for these outings. He had only one number pre-programmed into it. The phone rang twice before a crisp, British-accented voice answered. "Yes, Simon." "It's me." There was a short pause. Simon Price wasn't just Julian's CEO. He was his anchor, a man of impeccable logic and unwavering loyalty. Simon had been with Julian since the beginning. He was the only person in the world who knew about Julian's secret trips. "Julian, are you all right? You sound—" "I'm fine." Julian cut him off, his tone sharp. "But something happened at the Chicago Steer. A problem with the service. I can have the regional manager there in the morning. I assure you the quarterly reports are excellent." "The reports are a lie, Simon," Julian said, his voice low and powerful. He quickly recounted the night's events, from his disguise to the contemptuous hostess to the arrogant manager, Conrad Thorne. Then he described the waitress, Clara, her composure, her worn-out shoes, and his paradoxical order. Finally, he read the words on the napkin aloud. A silence hung on the other end of the line. Simon was an information processor working with facts and numbers, not with cryptic warnings from waitresses. "Poisoning the supply chain," Simon repeated slowly. "That's a very specific and serious accusation. It could be slander from a disgruntled employee. This waitress, Clara Bennett, does she have a grievance? She had fear in her eyes, Simon. A fear that goes beyond having a bad boss. Thorne cornered her after she took my order. He threatened her. She was terrified. Yet she still did this. Julian stared at the napkin. People don't risk everything for a minor grievance. There's more to it. I can feel it. Instinct is not evidence, Julian, Simon cautioned, his voice filled with concern. A direct accusation against a manager based on an anonymous note is problematic. Thorne could sue for libel. I'm not going to accuse him. I'm going to investigate him, Julian said. I need you to get me everything you can on Conrad Thorne. Work history, financial records, social media, everything. But it has to be completely off the books. No internal audit trails, no red flags. Use the external contractors we use for hostile takeover due diligence. I want to know who this man is before sunrise. All right, Simon said, his tone shifting from skeptical to operational. What about the ledger? She mentioned the one in his office. This was the core of the issue. I need to get it, Julian said. Tonight, before he has a chance to suspect something is wrong and destroy it. Julian, you can't be serious, Simon protested. You can't break into your own restaurant. It's too reckless. We can arrange a surprise audit officially. We can seize the records legally. No, Julian insisted. An official audit will give him time to react, to hide everything. I saw the way he looked at me when I left. He suspects Jim, the man who ordered a meal worth over $1,000 and left no tip. If an audit team shows up tomorrow, he'll connect the dots. The element of surprise is our only advantage. I have to get that ledger tonight before he arrives in the morning. A weary sigh came through the phone. This is why your father worried about you, Arthur, Simon said gently. You have a whole company to do this, yet you insist on fighting in the trenches yourself. My father also told me never to ask a man to do something I'm not willing to do myself, Julian said. Besides, who would suspect a man who looks like me is a corporate burglar? My disguise is the perfect cover. Simon was silent for a moment. Julian knew he was weighing the enormous risks against the potential disaster of a compromised supply chain. All right, Simon said finally, the resignation clear in his voice. But you're not going alone. I have a contact in Chicago, a security specialist. Her name is Nix. Former MI6, specializes in non-destructive entry and data retrieval. She's the best. I'll have her meet you. Send me your location. Good, Julian said, a sense of momentum building. Also, I need information on the waitress, Clara Bennett. Find out everything you can about her. If she's telling the truth, she's in danger. If she's lying, I need to know why. I'll get right on it, Simon said. Nix will contact you on this number within the hour. Be careful, Julian. This time it feels different. I know, Julian said, looking at the whiskey he hadn't touched. That's what worries me. He ended the call and sent his location to Simon. Waiting was the hardest part. He sat in the booth, the bar's low chatter and melancholic music, a backdrop to his racing thoughts. He thought of Clara's face, the mixture of fear and defiance. He had held the fate of multi-million-dollar deals in his hands, with less anxiety than he felt now for the young woman he barely knew. She had put her faith in a complete stranger, a ghost in a shabby jacket. He could not let her down. As the revolving glass doors of the Gilded Steer slowly closed, Julian Reed felt like he had just escaped a prison. The cold, damp air of late-night Chicago touched his skin, carrying the smell of exhaust rain and a freedom he had craved. He was no longer Julian Reed, the illustrious financial tycoon. He was just Jim, a man in a worn-out jacket standing under the faint streetlights. But that freedom only lasted a moment. The napkin in his hand, still warm from Clara's body heat, seemed to burn his skin. It wasn't a regular piece of cloth. It was an indictment, a cry for help, a declaration of war. He leaned against the brick wall of the adjacent building, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Julian had negotiated billion-dollar deals, but he had never felt an adrenaline rush like this. He unfolded the napkin. Under the dim streetlight, the hastily written words seemed to dance. They are watching you. The kitchen is not safe. Check the ledger in Thorne's office. He is poisoning the supply chain. Julian read each word, swallowing them whole. The phrase poisoning the supply chain was like a punch to his gut, knocking the air out of him. This wasn't a minor issue of poor service or monetary fraud. It was a crime. A betrayal of customers, a deliberate act of harming human health. If what Clara wrote was true, it was an indelible stain, a cancer in the empire he had spent his life building. He began to think. They are watching you. Who, Thorne, or a larger organization? Maybe they already knew Julian was there, or maybe they knew that a stranger had come, someone who didn't belong in that space. Julian didn't know, but he knew he had to act fast. If they knew, Thorne could destroy the evidence. Julian pulled out his burner phone, a simple, untraceable device he kept for these adventures. He had only one number pre-programmed into it. Simon Price's number. He pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before Simon answered, his voice professional and alert as usual. Yes, Simon. It's me. There was a pause. Simon was used to Julian's unexpected calls, but Julian's tone this time was different. It was more than just fatigue or disappointment. It was an urgency, a cold rage. Julian, are you all right? You sound different. I'm not all right, Simon, Julian said, wasting no time. Something has happened at the Gilded Steer. A very big problem. Very big. I can have the regional manager there immediately to resolve any service issues. Their quarterly reports are excellent. Maybe it's just a minor incident, Simon said, his voice full of professionalism. The reports are a lie. It's all a charade, Julian said. I was treated like a beggar, and I found something even worse. Julian quickly recounted the entire story. He told him about being scorned about Conrad Thorne and how he treated the employees. He told him about Clara, her tired eyes, and her genuine kindness. And finally, he read the lines on the napkin aloud. The silence on the other end of the line was long and heavy. Julian could hear Simon breathing. He knew Simon was processing the information. Simon was a man of logic, data, and evidence. Julian's story sounded like a cheap horror movie. Poisoning the supply chain, Simon repeated slowly, as if trying to grasp the meaning of the phrase. That's a very specific and serious accusation. It could be slander from a disgruntled employee, Julian. This waitress, Clara Bennett, what reason does she have to do this? She had fear in her eyes, Simon. A fear that goes beyond having a bad boss. Conrad cornered her after she took my order. He threatened her. She was terrified. Yet she still did this. She risked everything to give me this. People don't do that for a minor grievance. There's more to it. I can feel it. Instinct is not evidence, Julian, Simon said, his voice filled with concern. A direct accusation against a manager based on an anonymous note is problematic. Conrad Thorne could sue for libel. I'm not going to accuse him. I'm going to investigate him, Julian said, his voice full of determination. I need you to get me everything you can on Conrad Thorne. Work history, financial records, social media, everything. But it has to be completely off the books. No internal audit trails, no red flags. Use the external contractors we use for hostile takeover due diligence. I want to know who this man is before sunrise. I'll get right on it, Simon said. What about the ledger? She mentioned the one in his office. This was the core of the issue. I need to get it, Julian said. Tonight before he has a chance to suspect something is wrong and destroy it. Julian, you can't be serious, Simon protested. You can't break into your own restaurant. It's too reckless. We can arrange a surprise audit officially. We can seize the records legally. No, Julian insisted. An official audit will give him time to react to hide everything. I saw the way he looked at me when I left. He suspected Jim, the man who ordered a meal worth over $1,000 and left no tip. If an audit team shows up tomorrow, he'll connect the dots. The element of surprise is our only advantage. I have to get that ledger tonight before he arrives in the morning. A weary sigh came through the phone. That's why your father worried about you, Julian, Simon said gently. You have an entire company to do this, yet you insist on fighting in the trenches yourself. My father also told me never to ask a man to do something I'm not willing to do myself, Julian said. Besides, who would suspect a man who looks like me as a corporate burglar? My disguise is the perfect cover. Simon was silent for a moment. Julian knew he was weighing the enormous risks against the potential disaster of a compromised supply chain. All right, Simon said finally, the resignation clear in his voice. But you won't go alone. I have a contact in Chicago, a security specialist. Her name is Nix. Former MI6, specializes in non-destructive entry and data retrieval. She's the best. I'll have her meet you. Send me your location. Good, Julian said, a sense of momentum building. Also, I need information on the waitress Clara Bennett. Find out everything you can about her. If she's telling the truth, she's in danger. If she's lying, I need to know why. I'll get right on it, Simon said. Nix will contact you on this number within the hour. Be careful, Julian. This time, everything feels different. I know, Julian said, looking at the whiskey he hadn't touched. That's what worries me. Julian ended the call and sent his location to Simon. Waiting was the hardest part. He sat in the booth, the bar's lively chatter, and melancholic music, a backdrop to his racing thoughts. He thought of Clara's face, the mix of fear and determination. He had held the fate of multi-million-dollar deals in his hands with less anxiety than he felt now for the young woman he barely knew. She had put her faith in a complete stranger, a ghost, in a shabby jacket. He could not let her down. 45 minutes later, Julian Reed's burner phone vibrated. A single-line text message appeared. Back alley, black sedan, 2 minutes. Julian put down the whiskey, which he still hadn't touched, paid for the drink, and slipped out of the bar through a back exit that led into a narrow alley filled with trash and deep shadows. As promised, an unassuming black sedan glided silently to a stop, its engine almost noiseless. The back door opened. Julian got in. The woman in the driver's seat didn't turn around. She was observing Julian through the rearview mirror. She had a sharp face and short black hair. Her eyes were like chips of ice. Simon says you need a ghost, she said, her voice a low rasp. Ghosts are expensive. I can afford it, Julian replied. So I hear, she said, an unreadable light flickering in her eyes. I'm Nix. I was given the brief. You want to break into a manager's office at the Gilded Steer and retrieve a ledger. Is it a physical ledger or on a computer? Julian asked. The note just said ledger, Julian said. We have to assume it could be both or one of the two. Amateur, Nix mumbled, but not unkindly. All right. The restaurant closes to the public at midnight. Staff is out by 1 a.m. The cleaning crew arrives at 4 a.m. That gives us a 3-hour window. The building has a state-of-the-art Blackwood security system. She glanced at him in the mirror again. Ironic. Can you bypass it? I could bypass the Pentagon with a paperclip and a stick of gum, she said, without a hint of arrogance. It was a simple statement of fact. But your problem isn't the main building security. The manager's office will have its own system, a separate keypad, possibly a motion sensor, and Thorne himself. A slimy man like that is a paranoid man. He might have his own cameras. What's the plan? Julian asked, feeling a surge of adrenaline. Simple, Nix said, putting the car in gear and pulling out of the alley smoothly. You're going back in, but not as a customer. She reached into the passenger seat and pulled out a duffel bag. The cleaning company is called Sparkle Clean Solutions. This is your new uniform. You're my assistant. Try to look like you know how to hold a mop. The plan was both audacious and brilliant. They wouldn't be breaking in. They would be walking in the front door. Julian and Nix drove to a staging area in a nearby parking lot. Simon Price had worked his magic. He had infiltrated the cleaning company's schedule, adding 2 extra workers for tonight's shift at the Gilded Steer. He had created employee profiles for them, complete with names and social security numbers that would pass a cursory check. As Julian changed into the gray protective suit of a cleaner, he felt the last vestiges of his billionaire persona being shed. He was now Mike, a night cleaner. Nix, already in her uniform, handed him an ID badge. Remember, she said, her voice all business. We move with purpose. We don't linger. We don't make eye contact unless we have to. We are invisible. Once we're inside, I'll neutralize the internal security system in Thorne's office. You'll be my lookout. Your only job is to watch the hallway. If you see anything, you tap your earpiece once. No talking, just a tap. She handed him a small earpiece. Understood. Understood. Julian said, his mouth dry. As they drove toward the silent, dark restaurant, Julian's phone vibrated. It was a text from Simon. He opened it. It was a preliminary profile on Clara Bennett. Clara Bennett, 23 years old. No criminal record. Dropped out of City College's accounting program 2 years ago. Sole guardian of her younger brother, Leo Bennett, 17. Leo has late-stage cystic fibrosis. Medical bills exceed $300,000 annually. Insurance has expired. Numerous outstanding loans in her name. Lives in a small apartment in a low-income housing project. Her mother passed away 3 years ago. Father is unknown. Julian's blood ran cold. This wasn't a disgruntled employee. This was a young woman drowning. Her desperation wasn't for herself. It was for her brother. The decision to write that note was more than just courage. It was an act of immense selfless love. And Conrad Thorne, by threatening her job, had a gun to her brother's head. The stakes of the night had become infinitely higher. This was no longer about his company. It was about justice for Clara. Nix drove the van with the Sparkle Clean Solutions logo to the service entrance at the back of the Gilded Steer. Showtime, she said, her eyes already scanning every shadow. Try not to get us caught, billionaire. The service entrance of the Gilded Steer was a world away from its luxurious facade. The air here smelled of old grease-cleaning chemicals and the fatigue of long shifts. Julian, in his Sparkle Clean Solutions uniform, felt his billionaire persona completely shed. He was no longer Julian Reed. He was Mike, a night cleaner. Nyx moved with the grace of a panther. She didn't walk. She glided, blending into the shadows and leaving no trace. She gestured to Julian with a small hand signal, and he clumsily pushed the armored cleaning cart forward. The wheels squeaked on the concrete floor, the only sound breaking the silence. "You look like a novice," Nyx whispered through the earpiece. "Try not to spill the water." "I'll try," Julian replied, his voice dry. They passed the kitchen where knives and pots were neatly hung on the walls, glistening under the dim light. Everything was perfectly organized, a facade concealing the rot underneath. Julian felt a wave of nausea. He had been serving contaminated meat to his customers. They arrived at Conrad Thorne's office. It was located at the end of a narrow hallway, a sturdy wooden door with a carefully polished brass nameplate. Nyx stopped, pulling out a small device from her pocket. She started to work. She wasn't rushed, but every movement was purposeful. She neutralized the security camera, then the motion sensor, and finally the keypad. "This door seems to be the last thing he wants opened," Nyx said. "He's added a secondary lock. I'll need a few more minutes." While Nyx worked, Julian stood guard. He pushed the cleaning cart closer, pretending to mop the floor. He looked down the hallway where the light from a blinking alarm sign flickered on the wall. He could feel Nyx's tension through the earpiece. Suddenly, there was a sound. Footsteps. Julian froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. "Yes," Nyx replied. "Someone is coming our way. He's not a cleaner." Julian saw a man in a security guard uniform walking toward them. He had a flashlight and was shining it into every corner. Julian knew they had only a few seconds. He had to do something. Julian lifted the mop from the cart, spilling some water from the bucket onto the floor. He pretended to slip and fell. The loud noise echoed in the quiet hallway. "Hello!" The guard called, his voice full of alertness. "Is anyone there?" Julian stood up, feigning pain. "Yes, it's me," he called out. "I'm just a cleaner. I just fell." The guard came closer. He looked at Julian with a suspicious gaze. "Are you all right?" "Yes, I'm fine," Julian said, trying to make his voice sound normal. "I'm just a little clumsy." The guard looked at Julian, then at the cart and the mop. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," Julian said. "I'm sorry for the noise." The guard nodded, but his eyes were still filled with suspicion. He continued walking, but Julian knew he would be back. They only had a few minutes. "Done," Nyx whispered. "Go in." Julian opened the door and entered the office. He closed the door behind him, and the noise from the hallway disappeared. Conrad Thorne's office was a place that clearly displayed the arrogance of a small man. The walls were adorned with plaques and photos of Thorne standing next to celebrities. Nyx only glanced at them. "No physical ledger," she said. Julian looked around. He saw a large bookshelf filled with management books. He recalled a detail from his conversation with Conrad. He was a paranoid man. He wouldn't leave evidence in a visible place. He went to the bookshelf and started to search. He saw a specific book with a small symbol drawn on the spine. It was the symbol of a baseball trophy. Julian remembered Thorne bragging about his baseball team's trophy. Julian gambled that Thorne's code would be something personal. He was right. "There's a hidden safe behind the bookshelf," Julian whispered through the earpiece. Nyx came closer. "I can't open it quickly or quietly." Julian offered a suggestion. "Thorne is an arrogant man. He'll use something that means something to him. Maybe a date or a number." Nyx nodded. She started entering numbers. She tried a few numbers without success. Julian looked at a photo of Thorne with his baseball team. He saw a number on his jersey. "Try the number 1, Julian said. A few beeps, a silence. Then a small click. Nix had opened the safe. Inside was a large amount of cash, a passport, and a black leather-bound ledger. Nix worked with incredible speed. She used a camera pen to photograph every page of the ledger. At the same time, another of her devices was copying an encrypted partition on Thorne's computer. The data was completely copied, and Nix carefully put everything back in its original place. She erased every trace of herself leaving the office as if no one had ever entered. As they left the office, the guard was coming back. He looked at them with a suspicious gaze. "Can I help you too?" "No," Nix said. "We just finished our work. We're leaving now." The guard looked at Julian. "You seem to be in pain." "Yes, I'm fine," Julian said, his voice full of confidence. "I just slipped a little. I'll be more careful next time." The guard nodded, but his eyes were still full of suspicion. Julian knew they were lucky. They had gotten out safely. Julian and Nix walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind an atmosphere of tension. They walked toward the car. As Julian sat in the car, he felt a sense of relief. He had done it. He had gotten the evidence. He had protected Clara. Julian looked at his phone. He had the evidence. He could bring down Conrad Thorne, but he knew this was just the beginning. Conrad Thorne was just a small fish in a big ocean. Julian had to do more. Julian looked at Nix. "I need you to find out about Prime Organic Meats, and I need you to find out about the network Thorne is working with." "All right," Nix said, "but it's going to be expensive." "I can afford it," Julian said. "This is a war, and I'm ready." Nix nodded. She had found a man she could trust, and Julian had found a person he could rely on. The night hunt was over, but the war had just begun. Dawn in Chicago never comes abruptly. It begins with a subtle shift in the sky's color from a deep black to a steel gray, then a fragile orange streak spreading through the clouds, finally painting the skyscrapers in a warm light. Julian hadn't slept. He sat in his penthouse office, looking out at the city slowly waking up. The computer screen in front of him was a gateway to a world he had never known, a world hidden beneath the perfect facade of his empire. He had transferred all the data Nix had collected to Simon Price's secure server. Simon and his team had worked through the night, analyzing every line of data, every number, every video. Julian couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen. He felt a powerful urge to know the truth, no matter how terrible it was. The call from Simon came at 5 a.m., just as the first sunlight touched the tops of the tall buildings. Simon's voice had lost its usual professional tone, replaced by a cold and enraged one. "Julian," Simon said, "what Ms. Bennett wrote, it's all true." A heavy silence fell between them. "Tell me everything," Julian commanded. Simon began to speak, his voice steady as if reading a terrible report. "The ledger and encrypted files show that Conrad Thorne was doing more than just siphoning money from the company. He's a link in a large-scale criminal organization. The company, Prime Organic Meats, he listed on the invoices. That's a shell company. The real supplier is Westland Meats, a meat processing plant that was shut down by the Department of Health 6 months ago for severe bacterial contamination." Julian felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. "Bacterial contamination," he whispered. "Exactly," Simon said. "Thorne was deliberately buying dirty substandard meat at an extremely low price and serving it to customers at the Gilded Steer. The profits were transferred to an account belonging to a front company then laundered for the criminal organization. Poisoning the supply chain wasn't a metaphor, Julian. He was literally poisoning our customers. Julian closed his eyes. He felt as if a mortal wound was opening up inside him. His empire, a symbol of luxury and quality, had been corrupted by a greedy man. He had thought the gilded steer was a jewel, but it turned out to be a garbage can. "What about the videos?" Julian asked, his voice filled with fury. "We found the encrypted videos in a hidden partition on his computer," Simon said. "It was his insurance. The videos show Thorne blackmailing Clara Bennett. He exploited her accounting knowledge to force her to help him falsify the ledgers, believing this would make her an accomplice and ensure her silence. He used her brother's illness, Leo, as a hostage." Julian clenched his fists. He felt an unprecedented anger surge within him. Thorne wasn't just a crook. He was a monster. He had taken advantage of a young woman doing everything she could to save her brother. He had turned her sacrifice into a tool to commit his crimes. Simon continued, his voice now full of contempt. "Thorne underestimated Clara. He thought fear would silence her. But he didn't account for her conscience or her courage. He created his most dangerous enemy." Julian couldn't speak. The truth was too horrifying. The story wasn't just about fraud. It was about bottomless greed and cruelty. It was about a brave woman who stood up against evil even though she knew she might pay for it with everything. "I've already contacted the FBI and the FDA," Simon said. "They're ready to move on your signal. We can launch a coordinated raid simultaneously." "Not yet," Julian said. "Thorne needs to see who brought him down. And this needs to be handled carefully for Clara's sake. She's the hero of this story, not me." Julian turned to look out at the city. The sunlight had illuminated his entire kingdom, but he now saw the cracks, the shadows. He had built an empire, but he hadn't known that it had been infected from within. Julian felt a profound change in his soul. The emptiness was gone. His solitude had been replaced by a righteous indignation. This fight wasn't just to protect his brand. It was to find justice for Clara. She had trusted him, a stranger in a worn-out jacket, and he would not let her down. The dawn had come. And Julian Reed, a man who had once lived in the shadows of power, had found the light of truth. He was ready for the fight. The morning sun streamed through the bulletproof glass of the Reed Global Holdings skyscraper, illuminating a man who had undergone a complete transformation. Julian Reed was no longer Jim the Drifter, with a tired, scruffy look and eyes filled with loneliness. The perfectly tailored graphite suit had replaced the old jacket, with every line exuding power and dignity. This was Julian Reed, chairman of the board of a global conglomerate, the man whose voice could shake markets. His loneliness had dissolved, replaced by a cold, simmering fire of righteous anger. That fire wasn't because his assets were threatened, but because a woman had been exploited and a child had been made a hostage. Beside Julian was Simon Price. Simon's eyes showed not only his usual concern, but also a profound respect. He had seen Julian fight in the trenches and understood that though Julian owned an empire, he was still a warrior. "The FBI and FDA are ready to move on your signal, Julian," Simon said, his tone professional and decisive. "This will be a coordinated strike, a lethal blow." Julian shook his head. "Not yet, Simon. Conrad Thorne needs to know who brought him down, and we have to handle this very carefully for Clara's sake. She is the hero of this story, not me." At 11:45 a.m., as the Gilded Steer was preparing for the lunch rush, two large, black, unmarked SUVs pulled up in front of the restaurant. Their arrival caused all activity inside to fall silent. Conrad Thorne, with his usual smug smile, rushed to the door, believing they were famous guests. His smile vanished, replaced by panic, when he recognized that the man stepping out of the car was Julian Reed. Julian strode into the restaurant, flanked by Simon and two other men who were impeccably dressed, but had the sharp eyes of FBI agents. The restaurant staff stood frozen, not daring to move. Julian's voice echoed in the silent space, full of authority. "Mr. Thorne, we have a few things to discuss." Julian walked directly to the small, wobbly table in the corner where he had sat the night before. "Table 32, he said. "I had a meal here last night. It was very enlightening." All the color drained from Conrad's face, and he looked at Julian in panic. He had connected the powerful man in front of him with the drifter from last night. You are," he stammered. Julian just nodded gently. Thorne knew he had been tricked. "My office," Conrad stammered, leading Julian and his companions into the small room where he had blackmailed Clara. Inside the room, Julian walked straight to the bookshelf. "A baseball trophy," he murmured, pointing to the discreetly hidden trophy. "Is that where you keep the evidence of your relationship with Westland Meats?" Conrad Thorne slumped into the leather chair, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice trembling. Simon stepped forward with a tablet displaying a full screen of evidence: the ledger, the falsified invoices, the shipping manifest from the contaminated meat plant. "We know everything, Gregory," Simon said coldly. "The money laundering, the contaminated meat. All of it." He scrolled to the final image, a video of Thorne blackmailing Clara. "And we know you blackmailed one of your waitresses," Julian said, his voice filled with outrage. "You exploited her brother's illness to force her into complicity. That is something I cannot tolerate." "She helped," Conrad stammered, trying to shift the blame. "She fixed the ledgers." Julian opened the office door. "Clara," he called, his voice now gentle. "Would you come in here, please?" Trembling, Clara walked into the office. She looked at the shaking Conrad in the chair, then at Julian with a mix of confusion and fear. "Clara," Julian said gently, "Mr. Thorne claims that you were his accomplice. He says you willingly helped him fix the ledgers." Clara looked at Conrad, then down at the floor. "He's lying," she whispered, her voice gradually gaining strength. "He threatened me. He threatened to ruin my brother's medical treatment. He forced me to do it." Julian nodded. "I believe you." He turned to the agents. "I think you have enough evidence." As the agents handcuffed Conrad and led him away, a deathly silence filled the room. Julian turned to Clara. "Last night, a person in this restaurant showed incredible integrity and courage," he said, his voice echoing through the room. "That person risked everything to expose a crime, not for personal gain, but because it was the right thing to do. That person was you, Clara." Tears streamed down Clara's face. She thought Julian had come to punish her, to fire her, but instead he was praising her. "Your fabricated debt has been cleared," Julian continued. "Furthermore, Reed Global Holdings will establish a medical trust to cover all of your brother's medical expenses for life." Clara sobbed uncontrollably. Her fear and despair had vanished, replaced by immense relief. Julian had not only freed her from Conrad, but had also lifted the burden that had been crushing her for so long. "And as for you," Julian said, his voice turning serious, "a person of your integrity shouldn't be wasting your talent here. I'm creating a new position within the company, Director of Ethical Oversight. You will run a new employee welfare fund and oversee our supply chain. You will report directly to me. Clara was stunned, unable to believe what she had just heard. From a blackmailed waitress, she had become a director. Are you sure? She whispered. A person of your integrity is a company's most valuable asset, Julian said softly. Do you accept? Yes, she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief and endless joy. Yes, I accept. Julian Reed hadn't found a hero. He had created one. And he had found something more valuable than money faith in a woman who had risked everything to do the right thing. As the FBI agents handcuffed Gregory Thorne and led him out of the office, a deathly silence fell over the entire restaurant. The metallic clash of the handcuffs echoed in the opulent space, shattering the illusion of perfection and luxury. The servers stood frozen, and the diners looked at each other in confusion, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Thorne, whom they had always considered a symbol of power and success, was now a criminal being led away like a captured animal. Julian Reed turned to look at Clara Bennett. She stood there, trembling, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had endured so much, and finally the truth had been exposed. She no longer had to be afraid, no longer had to hide. Julian felt her relief, and a deep sense of pride surged within him. Last night, Julian said, his voice echoing in the empty space, a person in this restaurant showed incredible integrity and courage. That person risked everything to expose a crime not for personal gain, but because it was the right thing to do. That person was you, Clara. Clara looked at him speechless. Her tears flowed freely, and she didn't try to hold them back. They were not tears of pain, but of liberation. She had thought Julian had come to punish her, to fire her. But instead, he was praising her. Your fabricated debt has been cleared, Julian continued. Furthermore, Reed Global Holdings will establish a medical trust to cover all of your brother's medical expenses for life. Clara sobbed, collapsing onto a chair, unable to believe what she had just heard. The burden that had been crushing her for so long had vanished. She no longer had to worry about medical bills or debts. She no longer had to worry about losing her job. She was free. And as for you, Julian said, his voice becoming serious, a person of your integrity should not be wasting your talents here. I have created a new position within the company, Director of Ethical Oversight. You will run a new employee welfare fund and oversee our supply chain. You will report directly to me. Clara was stunned, unable to believe what she had just heard. From a blackmailed waitress, she had become a director. Are you sure? She whispered. A person of your integrity is a company's most valuable asset, Julian said gently. Do you accept? Yes, she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief and an endless joy. Yes, I accept. Julian looked at her, and he saw that she was no longer a desperate woman. She was a strong woman, a woman who had fought and won. And he, a man who had lost faith in the world, had found a hero. The incident at the Gilded Steer became a major media story. The press reported on the scandal about a billionaire who had personally investigated a criminal case. Julian used this story to restructure and clean up his system. He fired all the managers involved in the incident, and he introduced a new code of ethics for all employees. Clara Bennett became a symbol. She was the face of integrity and courage. She became a well-known figure throughout the city. Julian had helped her find her true self again, and he had found a true friend. The relationship between Julian and Clara wasn't just boss and employee. They became friends, a mentor, and a mentee, and companions. Julian shared with her his loneliness, and Clara helped him reconnect with the world. Julian realized that true wealth isn't money, but the trust and courage of a single person. His journey had ended with a new story, a story of integrity, courage, and positive change.